The Last of Us. What can I say about this game that hasn't already been said? It's considered the developer's magnum opus, was consistently lauded as a crowning achievement in storytelling. It's one of 2 games released that year that finally brought huge attention to its leading gentleman. None of this is news. If you know anything about this game, you'll know how people feel about it. And appropriately enough, I'm here to tell you how I feel about it. Developed by Naughty Dog and published by Sony for the PS3 in June 2013 and the PS4 in 2014, The Last of Us is a post-apocalyptic, third-person action-adventure, survival horror, character-driven, you-know-the-drill game, focused primarily upon its heavily character-driven story. Initially leaked in 2011 after an apparently accidental reveal in the form of an Uncharted 3 Easter egg, the game was officially announced on the 10th of December at the Spike Video Game Awards. The initial trailer is an interesting and unique proof of concept more than anything. It gives a decent indicator of what was intended to come, and re-examining it in the wake of the game's release brings to light some of the subtler changes that the game went through. Even back then, it's clear that Naughty Dog had already developed a strong foundation and were almost 100% confident in what they were creating. If there is something that Naughty Dog are consistent with, it's their ability to create compelling characters, even if the situations they find themselves in aren't always overly fascinating. The last decade of gaming has seen a huge rise in high-intensity, character-driven drama, and I suspect a good deal of thanks should be sent Naughty Dog's way for that cultural shift. The early days of The Last of Us certainly showcased their standout trademarks, and with barely a word said throughout the entire thing.
This is our routine. Day and night, all we do is survive. It never lets up.
Speaking of which, Ellie's voiceover suggests a much less story-focused game, perhaps with greater survival elements, perhaps an indication that the game might once have been fashioned around staying alive rather than the Journey to the West style that the game ultimately ended up as. The change is by no means a bad one. The simple day-in, day-out survival implied in the VGA trailer would have translated poorly into the final product. It would have been much more generic at best, and bland and forgettable at worst. Instead, what we got was an exemplar of the action-adventure genre and a unique emotional tour de force. Many games strive and often struggle to provoke an emotional reaction in gamers these days.
Your watch is broken.
Indeed, it seems to be far more at the forefront of developers' priorities today than it was as little as half a decade ago. Nobody was thinking of the emotional impact of Marcus Phoenix's struggle, that's for damn sure. The Last of Us may not have changed that entirely per se, but it certainly affected the grander video game landscape. Ripples spread through the industry, the reliably fun-loving platform-em-up Naughty Dog has suddenly produced a tear-jerking, heart-crushing dystopian epic. The kind that comes along only once in a blue moon. And suddenly, everybody wanted in on the tear-jerker train. Now for a word of caution, this video will spoil the entirety of the game. If you have any intention of playing The Last of Us, or even remotely interested in it at all, or are even the tiniest bit curious, I strongly recommend playing the game first. In fact, I'd insist upon it. I'll wait right here. I'd like to kick this off with a confession. I did not enjoy The Last of Us the first time I played it. That's not to say that I thought it was a bad game, nor that I outright hated it, but more that I was left with a general feeling of neither here nor there. I wasn't blown away, but I enjoyed it enough to replay it shortly after in an attempt to improve my initial impression. The biggest reason for this will become apparent as I progress through the review. I'll be pointing out the particular section of the game that hugely coloured my opinion of it. A section that left a bitter taste in my mouth for a very long time afterwards. But for now, let's just say that I have certainly mellowed out over time. Subsequent playthroughs have been much more rewarding, and my opinion of The Last of Us has vastly improved as a result. I'll elaborate as I go, but it helps to know a little of my background with this game, to understand that I've experienced it from both ends of the spectrum. For the sake of ease, I'll be splitting this review into 4 individual sections: mechanics, tech and environment, music and miscellaneous, and story. If there's a particular topic you would like to jump to, the appropriate timestamp will be in the description. Though remember, it is only natural that certain aspects of one section will filter into another. Either way, I'll begin by discussing the basic of basics, the game's mechanics. I don't think anyone who's played The Last of Us will argue that it's an especially complex game when it comes to the mechanics. The majority of your time will be spent exploring, moving from place to place and either admiring the scenery, enjoying the character banter, or haplessly sauntering your way through a dozen or so angry enemies. Every once in a while, the game will break up its action and exploration to have you carry a ladder or a plank to a context-sensitive triangle. Most frequent are sequences involving pushing Ellie across bodies of water on a surprisingly sturdy pallet. Now, I'm no physics major, so I'm not going to question the physics of this. I'm sure it's entirely possible if her centre of balance was perfect and Joel never faltered, but the way that he sways back and forth and occasionally ducks the pallet under the water often makes these sequences feel a lot more tense than they have any cause to be. It constantly feels like Ellie is a millisecond away from tumbling straight into the murky depths. I mean, look at that.
Teamwork.
As you might expect, the core mechanic of the game is its combat, and I'm pleased to concur with the majority. The combat mechanics are heavily refined, as fine-tuned as you might expect from a company who've been building on the similar, if faster-paced run-and-gun gameplay of the Uncharted series for the past decade. As the style of Uncharted's gunplay has evolved and bettered over time, The Last of Us feels like a natural evolution of that style. It's much more impressive and much more satisfactory. Each weapon has a satisfying weight and punch to it. The shotgun gives an expectant kick with a realistic sway and recoil to accommodate for its weight. The bow feels light and gentle. Arrow flight paths are noticeably imperfect, and they can and will miss if you attempt to just gung-ho a shot. The hunting rifle, one of the most powerful weapons in the game, is surprisingly weighty and can kill most enemies in one shot on all but the highest difficulties. But as a result, the recoil is huge, deterring any attempts at reckless rapid fire. Melee combat is similarly satisfying. There are bottles and bricks that you can throw as distractions, although occasionally enemies will hear the noise but not respond to it at all. Otherwise, if you're out of ammo or just want to preserve supplies, you can slap the enemies around with your bare fists. You can feel the weight of Joel's attacks with each punch. His entire weight is thrown into every strike, suitably conveying the feeling that he is trying to kill, not just beat down.
Man, you hit hard.
Well, I was trying to kill you.
Everything about Joel's posture, his attacks, his physique, is designed to assert his surety and confidence. He feels ragged and rugged, his age slowly eating away at his body. You can feel the lingering desperation every time Joel swings a fist or climbs a wall. His movements aren't slow and tanky, but nor are they light and gliding. The perfect balance is struck to accurately portray a man at best in his late 40s and at worst in his mid to late 50s.
Have Maria get some of your born-again friends to do it.
They got families too.
Tommy, I need this.
You can feel the weight of the world on Joel's shoulders, and I applaud the developers for managing this. Conveying so much in such a simple manner, something many developers would never bother to fine-tune, is indicative of the care and attention that Naughty Dog pours into its games. A cynical person might say that these things don't matter, the small details are worthless in a game that is so mechanically simple. I'll grant you, a cynical person might once have said that exact thing when they first played this game on its release day several years ago. But that person has since replayed the game multiple times, and believe me, those details matter. If you're feeling brave, you can try to stealth your way through, and this is by far the most enjoyable way to play the game. It often feels as though the odds are stacked against you if you try to just trailblaze your way through. Resort to stealth instead, and you'll find yourself overanalyzing every tiny environmental detail, learning the routes through areas, learning when and where enemies will show up and/or patrol, what triggers ambient dialogue between them, and so on and so forth. Making your way through areas like the dockyard during the Chasing Robert segment without triggering an alert phase, as it were, is supremely satisfying. The game does a fantastic job of making it feel as though your tactics and forward planning are actually paying off, rather than just attributing it to idiotic AI or Joel being a brick shithouse. This brings me to one of the final few unspoken for mechanics, listening mode. I don't have much to say on the matter other than that I strongly recommend playing the game without it. Listening mode is a somewhat overpowered mechanic that allows you to see, through something of an echolocation skill, enemies within a certain radius, through walls, through doors. For all the realism of Joel's build and character, this is one particular aspect of the game that feels a bit distracting. It's all too easy to rely on it. I found myself constantly diverting to it whenever I entered a new area, ruining the point of using stealth and tactics to navigate and survive. When I switched to Survivor difficulty, where listening mode is disabled, I quickly forgot that the mechanic ever existed at all. Without it, the game feels vastly more realistic and survival feels appropriately difficult. Enemies are an actual threat when you don't know where they are, as they should be. My suggestion is to play the game through once with listening mode available, then turn it off for any and all subsequent playthroughs. You'll find the experience far more satisfying. Having said that, if you ever pay passing attention to the checkpoints, you'll notice that even on the hardest difficulty, autosaves are incredibly liberal. The game saves before and after every encounter, and occasionally during them as well, depending on the size of the area and length of the encounter. Granted, whilst it would have been frustrating to have to replay certain sections over and over in the event of death, the lengthy chase with the armoured car in the city springs to mind as a particularly egregious example. The checkpoints are rarely ever longer than 10 minutes apart unless you actively take a long time with encounters. I'd imagine that the decision to space the checkpoints this way was done primarily with story concerns in mind. Since the game is heavily focused on its characters, Naughty Dog were likely concerned that if players died in a particular section too many times and had to replay any story segments, the impact of the narrative would be lessened exponentially until players were either frustrated enough not to care or simply lost their connection to the story. I can understand that, having gone through it myself, but as understandable as this decision is, it nonetheless deadens any sense of urgency or tension to the encounters, since you know a checkpoint is rarely more than a few minutes back or forth of you. There is one extremely immersion-breaking thing, which is the character versus enemy AI. As long as the enemy hasn't noticed Joel, the other NPCs are free to skate around to their heart's content. It's frankly bizarre to witness, and though the alternative would have been incredibly irritating, it is both ridiculous and pretty funny watching your companions leap joyfully about in front of the enemy's faces, whilst you methodically stealth your way through the area. There's also a crafting system, where you can create, for example, explosives, tins of scissors that blow up and chop people into teeny tiny bits, as well as health kits and shivs, which are ridiculously useful. You can also upgrade Joel through supplements, pills that you find lying around. And lastly, there's also the option to upgrade your weapons as well. Lastly, there is one mechanic I haven't mentioned yet. The game will occasionally have you shake the controller to rekindle the batteries in your torch. This is the only aspect of the game that I consider to be legitimately pointless.
Does that have anything to do with me?
It never really adds anything to the game other than a slight annoyance, and doesn't happen all that often to begin with. It is a bit of a waste of time, if I'm perfectly honest.
God damn it! Get ready!
For a game released at the tail end of the PlayStation 3's life cycle, The Last of Us is predictably good looking. Quite how graphically impressive it is, however, is something best witnessed. I'll let the game speak for itself for the most part, but I suppose impressive is as best a description as any. The game is beautiful. Environments are rich and thriving, a magnificent juxtaposition of the old world and the new. Flora and fauna crawl over the landscape as Earth takes back its kingdom. Collapsed buildings and the decrepit ruins of a once great civilization are skeletal remains telling a miserable but cautionary tale of how easy and how quickly mankind can descend into chaos. It's easy to say that this impressive tech is down to Naughty Dog being consistently exceptional with the graphical fidelity of their games, but they are still bound by the limitations of the technology they have to work with. And their accomplishment here is nothing short of superb. The PS3 is pushed to its absolute limit here, yet still creates incredibly sharp, crisp visuals. Granted, there's a distinct lack of anti-aliasing. Hard and jagged edges can be seen throughout the game, but it hardly seems to matter when environments are so heavily detailed and stunning to witness. On the PS3, the game runs at 720p30, with minimal frame drops, although there can be the occasional stutter during cutscenes. As you might expect, the game is far richer and smoother on the PS4, running at a solid 1080-60. And though the game gives you the option to lock it at 30fps, I never found this necessary. For the overwhelming majority of it, the 60 is perfectly solid, rarely faltering or indeed dropping at all. Enemy designs in regards to the infected are appropriately uncomfortable. Standard human foes are barely worth mentioning. They're people who act like people with slightly above average AI to compensate for the reused character models. Infected are a completely different story. There are 4 main types: runners, recently infected humans who look like your average human enemy but will tend to stand in a corner weeping unless you piss them off. Clickers, cabbage-faced individuals equipped with an insta-kill attack that requires an additional expensive upgrade to prevent, who are completely blind and can be ignored, provided you have the patience to stealth through certain areas. Stalkers, who are infected on the verge of becoming clickers but still maintain their vision, arguably the most dangerous enemy in the game given how difficult it is to distinguish them from normal runners, and as a result show up only a scant few times. And bloaters, enormous, long-infected individuals who have been parasitic hosts for so long that a thick, encrusted armour has spread over their entire body, and they are capable of throwing bombs of sorts that explode into clouds of spores. The enemy variety isn't huge, but it doesn't need to be, and it compensates for this deficiency anyway. All of the enemies are creepy. That's the best way that I can describe them. Bloaters are large and lumbering, and successfully sneaking around them feels like a reward in and of itself. The jerky, twitchy movements of the other infected give off an uncomfortable vibe. You know that the clickers are monsters not even remotely human anymore, and it is much easier to dissociate them from their former humanity. Runners, however, will stand still and ignore you for the most part. Watching them stand there weeping and then suddenly be attacked by them in a clearly uncontrollable flurry of madness is miserably depressing. Flashes of humanity linger behind their eyes, their movements. It feels much less like the sensible slaughter for survival that killing normal human enemies feels like, and more like putting them out of their misery. The standout aspect of the game is definitely its character animation. At least 85% of the game was motion capped, full body and facial, with cutscenes routinely being acted out multiple times, captured from numerous angles, over the course of 3 years.
You done? Am I done? You come into my house, you set off all my traps, you damn near break my shooting arm. Who the fuck is this punk and what's she doing here?
I am none of your goddamn business, and we're here because you owe Joel some favors. And you can start by taking these off.
I owe Joel some favors or some kind of...
All of the core cast mocap their parts. Troy Baker and Ashley Johnson notwithstanding, there was Marlene's Merle Dandridge, Tess's Anna Vershing, and Bill's W. Earl Brown, all participating in motion capture. Brown looks shockingly like Bill, actually, it's a little uncanny. The animations are full of subtle movements, capturing a full range of emotions in the most believably human way in a video game to date. In The Last of Us, character animation is so much more natural, almost fascinatingly so. Expressions twitch and change in such a curiously normal way that they can be distracting. Emotion is expertly crafted and expressed. Joel's posture will shift in tandem to the situation. He'll puff himself up before enemies or gruff NPCs, curl protectively around Ellie when they're in danger. Similarly, Ellie is cocky, arrogant when she needs to be, but at times the adult facade will slip away and the child within will briefly surface.
Maria told me about Sarah.
Ellie?
You are treading on some mighty thin ice here.
It's an unparalleled level of detail and works wonders in propagating the beautiful story and character dynamic that Naughty Dog have conceived. They want us to believe that it's real, and so with the expert animation and stunning voice acting, it is so.
Please don't. Oh no. Sarah. Move your hands, baby. I know, baby, I know. God. Listen to me, I know this hurts, baby. You're gonna be okay, baby. Stay with me. All right, I'm gonna pick you up. I know, baby, I know it hurts. Come on, baby, please. I know, baby, I know. Sarah. Baby. Don't do this to me, baby. Don't do this to me, baby. No. 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 Please. Please don't do this. Please. Ellie! Stop!
Fucking touch me!
It's okay. It's me. Look. It's me.
He tried to...
Oh, baby girl. It's okay.
Oh.
It's okay.
As you've likely gathered by now, the voice acting is sublime. Not just the central characters, but the supporting cast as well. Everybody has a believably downtrodden, survivor, guilt-riddled tone to them. Bill's voice shakes with barely withheld rage and paranoia when he discusses topics he's uncomfortable with. Tess and Joel ooze a subtle chemistry that speaks volumes of their years and times together without ever uttering a word on the subject. Marlene is seen so few times that any other game would give little opportunity to develop her, but when we first meet her, she is commanding and authoritative, immediately taking charge of the situation despite being injured. Characters drop enough hints and tidbits about one another throughout the game that we can build an idea of certain characters long before we actually meet them. Joel's voice is hardened steel, vicious and biting for a long while, but as time wears on, the layers of his anger and heavy past start to fall away. His tone takes on a warmth previously unheard, and come the end of the game, he speaks to Ellie with compassion and affection, a fatherly love he thought he'd abandoned.
Everyone I have cared for has either died or left me. Everyone fucking except for you. So don't tell me that I would be safer with someone else, because the truth is I would just be more scared.
Ellie, on the other hand, sheds her toughened exterior, opening herself up to allow much greater freedom for her childhood, and though she remains a strong and self-assured young woman, her experiences of the outside world, both the good and the bad, have had a clear effect on her. The unspoken is what makes The Last of Us so enjoyably complex. Deciphering it adds an entirely new layer to the game, expanding the experience into something truly unforgettable. Although for the most part I would say the game is put together brilliantly, with areas grand in scope and feeling huge despite primarily being linear pathways, there is one particular area of the early game that I feel is genuinely badly designed. This isn't down to the area design in and of itself, although it certainly doesn't help matters, but rather it's due to the enemy placement. So, about 2 hours or so into the game, you come across an underground railway of some sort with Tess and Ellie and are tasked with navigating through the last little section in almost complete darkness, surrounded by enemies. Which would not be a problem, were it not for two things: the enemy placement and the particular enemy you have to avoid. This short little section was an absolute nightmare the first time I played this game, so I'll ask you to forgive me if I sound irrationally frustrated or nitpicky over this. But please bear with me whilst I explain. This section contains roughly 8 enemies, 3 runners and 5 clickers. Sneaking around clickers isn't much of an issue throughout most of the game. You tend to have plenty of room, and if you do get cornered or spotted, it tends to be fairly easy to just run to a safer spot and take them out before they can reach you. In this section, however, there is precious little room to manoeuvre. The route through the area to the exit is extremely tight and limited, and forces you into close quarters with enemies that can and indeed do one-hit kill you if you so much as brush their ankles. At the point in the game that this section occurs, you have 2 guns, a pistol and a revolver, neither of which deal enough damage on anything above easy to stop the group from overwhelming you. You also will not have had enough supplements to acquire the clicker shiv ability, which allows you to knife a clicker during what would otherwise be a fatal grab. Prior to this point, you meet just 2 clickers, one at a time, and both in the collapsed building, one by itself when you're taught the basics of clicker stealth, and one tangled amidst a group of runners. The game prepares you for lone clickers, or one amongst easier enemies, but you are given no opportunity to observe and outwit or defeat a group of them before the game thrusts you into a confined space and says, deal with it. I'm sure there are plenty of people who had no issues with this area, but I found it nightmarish. Maybe I just suck at the game. Ignoring my personal issue with this area and looking at it from a completely objective angle, the tight spaces, lack of light, and the game's failure to properly prepare the player make this section one of the worst in the game. There are 2 other areas similar to it throughout the entire rest of the game. The first occurs several hours later when Joel is tasked with protecting Sam and must make his way through an underground bunker with several stalkers and clickers, and one right towards the end where around 15 to 20 enemies of all types are spread proportionately around a huge tunnel. Neither of these areas present as much of a problem, as both are much more open than the train station and occur so much further into the game that by the point they take place you will have several more weapons and far more supplies. I mentioned earlier that my initial impression of The Last of Us was less than cheery, and this section is pretty much the only reason why. The train station is a nightmare primarily because it happens so early on in the game. You can shiv clickers if you sneak up on them, but supplies before this point are extremely limited, and even if you have managed to save up some, you won't have enough to deal with all of the enemies here. If you're playing on any difficulty above normal, your only real option is to stealth through the area. There are not even remotely enough supplies to deal with them. Whilst the one saving grace of the area is that it's impossible to run out of bricks to throw as distractions, it can be incredibly time consuming and tedious to lure enemies back and forth whilst you scour the area for supplies, or indeed the exit. Although subsequent playthroughs have dampened this fury somewhat, every time I replay the game, I dread this section. Whilst the game is graphically superb, it does suffer from a few glaring technical issues, most notably on the PS3. During the course of the 3 runs I prepared for this review, I had the PS3 version crash 5 times, once during the end credits. Character models occasionally glitched, sometimes falling prey to a broken physics engine and dying in T-poses, and from time to time Joel would flat out refuse to climb something, instead only standing before it and jerkily raising his hands as if thinking about it before backing up and trying again. At times the audio was also completely cut out or cutscenes would fail to load, both of which forced a hard reset. The footage on screen is a completely unedited example of the game crashing whilst trying to load a cutscene. It did eventually load, but without sound. I wouldn't say that the game is riddled with issues. The PS3 version is certainly more prone to problems than the remaster, and I only had one problem with a slightly awkward climb during a survivor playthrough on the PS4. None of these issues are deal breakers, although I am of the slightly contentious opinion that many reviewers glossed over these problems in their haste to give the game perfect scores. I'm not denying that the game is technically magnificent, but it is by no means flawless. The issues, as mentioned above, can be game-breaking. I dislike hard resetting my PS3 at the best of times given the possibility of a system corruption, and so cannot simply ignore the fact that the original release saw this occur more often than was comfortable. It's by no means a Bethesda release, don't get me wrong. The game is, for the most part, fully functional, and I never had any issues with save corruption, but it does not deserve to be given a free pass on the tech problems simply by virtue of being a Naughty Dog game. If you were looking for my strongest negative opinion of this game, that was it just there. The soundtrack, composed by Gustavo Santaolalla, I humbly apologise if I butcher the name, I don't speak Spanish, I'm sorry, is easily the standout aspect of the game. Haunting and visceral, it is one of those rare soundtracks that is really enjoyable to listen to outside of the game itself. It's often understated, quiet and contemplative, whispering in the background whilst you go about your explorative business. It feels like a part of the scenery, sound effects, poignant and harrowing, and very much an integral part of the experience.
Hands in the air!
In a similar fashion, the creatures themselves feel like parts of the environment, as if they have been pried straight from the overgrown scenery. The flourishing, natural environments and huge, sweeping landscapes, usually locked in the distance, give the impression of a much larger, more beautiful world, kept distant from the caged, uninfected humans. Interior environments are wonderfully detailed. Echoes of former life hang from every ceiling, every wall. Computers, books and films lie in piles, disarrayed objects, giving the impression of a hurried evacuation. The degradation of other environments creates a sensation of nearness. If humanity could reclaim the cities, it wouldn't take much to clean it up and rebuild, but they always seem to be just slightly too far away to make it work. Their failing humanity and common decency is represented in the collapsing, dismal architecture left over from the human renaissance. If there is one thing that slightly bothers me though, it is the recycling of the Uncharted sound effect for objects of interest. Don't get me wrong, I don't have a better idea about what they might have used instead, but as someone who has played the Uncharted series to death, I found that persistent relic jingle chiming after 20 seconds of not progressing forward to be a little bit off-putting. I'm sure many people didn't notice or didn't care, and that's perfectly fine. For me though, it was a bit on the pointless side. I know that sounds nitpicky, it has absolutely no bearing on the overall quality of the game. It's just a tad distracting, is all.
You mumble in your sleep. I hate bad dreams.
And now we arrive at the most lauded aspect of The Last of Us, and the one I am sure most players consider to be its greatest, most memorable quality. The story. I've already applauded its use of subtle social cues and environmental detail to tell parts of the story, so my honest opinion of the core narrative? It's okay. It's not exceptional by any means. It's a fairly predictable but enjoyable, somewhat above standard examination of the human condition through the eyes of two very particular individuals. In terms of the narrative twists and turns, you can see them coming a mile away. Even if you knew nothing about the game, it would still be fairly obvious that Ellie's importance is bizarre, and so she must be special in some way, immune. It is obvious that Tess won't stick around long, as that would harm the burgeoning father-daughter dynamic between Joel and Ellie. Upon meeting Sam and Henry, the gentle foreshadowing and the lulling false sense of security should tip off all but the most naive of players that their tale will not end well. This game is very much centred around Joel and Ellie and makes no attempts to disguise this, making it unfortunately quite obvious that most side characters are little more than passing whims. That's not to say it isn't well written. In fact, it's extremely well written, with believable dialogue, banter, and complex motivations allowing for a broad spectrum of emotions for and sympathy with all but the most menial of characters. Naughty Dog have crafted two of the finest leads in a video game for a long while. They're almost unbearably human, flawed and cynical, making mistakes, distrusting one another, foolishly acting up for the sake of pissing one another off. Joel and Ellie's dynamic is what sets the game apart. The odds are so often stacked against the protagonists, and whilst the game does draw a fine line between these being believable odds and having to populate an area with enough enemies to make encounters last an adequate amount of time, it's an old, tried and tested story mechanic that works well in the game's favour. Stacked odds they may be, and as immersion-breaking as watching Joel beat the living shit out of 20 men without so much as a scratch is, the game never presents anything completely unrealistic. It always errs on just the right side of that fine line. In all honesty though, the game doesn't need to be narratively complex. It doesn't need a huge cast of characters or a moment where they all sit around a campfire for a philosophical debate. With a core cast of just 2 carrying the weight of the entire character-driven arc upon their shoulders, the game does exactly what it sets out to do. Tell the story of an aging man and a teenage girl both ravaged by loss and driven to cynicism by the world around them, coming to terms with the fact that they need one another to survive. It isn't complicated and it certainly isn't new, but it is presented in such an enjoyable, emotionally heart-wrenching manner that even the hardest of hearts should soften to see Joel slowly but surely open up and accept Ellie as not a substitute, but a true daughter. This attention to character detail is what allows The Last of Us to stand head and shoulders above its peers. It might not have a shocking 24-style narrative that draws you into a deepening rabbit warren of complexity. What it does instead is create a short, simple motif around which the rest of the game revolves and asks the players to pay attention for 12 hours. Seems simple enough to me. Rather than go through the entire story piece by piece, I'd like to focus on 4 particular segments: Sam and Henry's deaths, the famous Jurat Sequence, the hospital sequence, and the game's concluding scene. As characters, Sam and Henry aren't particularly noteworthy. There's nothing about them other than the fact that they don't continuously attempt to kill Joel and Ellie that makes them particularly unique or interesting. They are what the game intends them to be, a point at Joel and Ellie's crossroad, an intersecting story that just happens to coincide with what our protagonists need at that moment in time. Henry is something of a downer, persistently putting down Sam's attempts to enjoy the remnants of his childhood, and these brief but noticeable moments steer the player towards heavily empathising with Sam, which in turn makes his death all the more impactful. My focus on this scene is less to do with the emotional impact it has on the player and the protagonists, and more to do with the fact that this is one incident that clearly has a huge effect on Ellie, and the game almost entirely glosses over it. At the beginning of the act immediately following their deaths, Ellie attempts to talk to Joel about it, but only in an easily missable optional conversation. They are never brought up again, despite it being quite clear that Ellie desperately wants to talk about it. This bothers me. There are several other moments that are referenced throughout the game, moments that are similarly impactful but kept quiet for the right reasons, like David's death, for example. This strikes me as the sort of thing Joel and Ellie should be talking about. At the very least, the short conversation they have at the child's gravestone should have been a core element, but instead it is tucked away out of sight, frustratingly easy to stroll right past. Whilst you could argue that the game incites exploration for the sake of its survival mechanics, it's also worth bearing in mind that the game is still very linear. Areas are deceptively wide, appearing far more open than they are. And by the point in the game at which this optional conversation occurs, most of the previous areas have been tight and winding, and you have been corralled down singular pathways by an armoured car, a sniper, hordes of infected. I'm not saying everybody misses this conversation. In fact, if only to completely moot my point, I found it during my first run of the game anyway. What I'm saying is that it shouldn't have been optional. Something should have been said about Sam's death in the course of the core game, not relegated to a side moment of such brevity. I'm going to say right off the bat that I do not dislike this sequence. If you were expecting me to say that, you can breathe easy. That's not to say I think it's a perfect and beautiful moment, but I certainly don't hate it. And with that out of the way, for those of you unaware, the famous Jurat sequence seen on screen occurs in the final quarter of the game as Joel and Ellie are approaching the hospital where the Fireflies are holed up. Having just emerged not entirely unscathed from a horrific encounter with a group of cannibals, Ellie is quiet and brooding, introverted, barely listening to Joel and reluctant to persevere. You can make the argument that her encounter with the thoroughly vile David has turned her away from her goal of reaching the Fireflies. She feels lost and unsure, not quite purposeless, but uncertain as to whether handing herself over is worth it anymore. Ellie has seen glimpses of humanity she'd never thought possible before. Does she really want to save them, knowing what they have turned to? It's during this introspection that Ellie suddenly brightens up and runs off, leaving Joel panicking, and here we meet the free roaming giraffes, close enough to touch, beautifully animated and knowingly awe-inspiring. Their appearance is a moment of introspection and reverence, a vision of thriving nature in the wake of humanity's collapse. The freedom that Earth has found without the shackles of man around it. It's a fantastic moment of that, I completely agree. However, this is just me personally, but I feel that the giraffes should have remained further away, untouched and unspoiled, as it were, by Joel and Ellie. Whilst it is undoubtedly heartwarming to see Ellie reach out and touch these majestic creatures, something she's never seen before and never expected to see, I strongly feel that their proximity is unnecessary. For me, I think this section would have been much more effective if it had jumped straight to the rooftop after Ellie spotted the giraffes. Removing the part where they make contact would have afforded this sequence a feeling of awe and calm, but at the same time it would have represented one of the game's overarching themes much better, that of the unattainable. Joel and Ellie spend the entire game striving for a goal that seems persistently out of reach. They struggle tooth and nail to survive against increasingly overwhelming odds, but the more they fight, the less it seems that peace is achievable. Imagine if the giraffes had never come close. You catch a glimpse of their shadows, and then from a rooftop you see them walking slowly away, beautiful but unreachable. There in the distance is something visible, something tangible, but forever just slightly out of reach. A sensation of calm and normality that is always in view, but also always upon a horizon our protagonists are walking away from. Maybe it's just me, but I feel the scene would have benefited greatly from removing that proximity. Like I said, I don't dislike it. I just think it would have represented the game's themes and tone far more if they'd remained a distant vision. When I first played this game, my bitterness over the previously mentioned subway section was still present by the concluding sequence. That, coupled with my youth and utilitarian mindset, caused me to wish that I was given the option to allow Ellie to be sacrificed. Although the game subtly implies that Ellie was not given the choice, that the Fireflies simply sedated her without explaining what was about to happen, we know that this is what she wants. This is the purpose she's been striving for, and her meeting with the giraffes reaffirms that when she declines Joel's offer to turn around and go back. It isn't truly within Joel's right to take that purpose away from Ellie, but he does it anyway, with or without our consent. As this particularly philosophical Redditor points out, your reaction to the game's conclusion differs depending on the circumstances of your life, and I'm fully inclined to agree. My initial instinct was to let the Fireflies sacrifice Ellie to create a cure, and indeed I was somewhat annoyed that the game didn't give me the option to do so. Now don't get me wrong, I understand exactly why this would never have happened. After spending so long crafting Joel's fatherly attachment to Ellie, turning it on its head at the last moment would have been interesting but ultimately foolish, betraying the characters they've spent so long building up. As this Redditor suggests though, those of us who don't have children likely wouldn't react the same way as a parent might. The utilitarian in me says that given the choice, I would sacrifice Ellie for the greater good. But the realist in me knows full well that after months of peril, near-death escapes and a burgeoning, unwavering trust forming that unshakable bond, I, like Joel, would never let it happen. When it comes down to brass tacks, this is not about the player, this is about Joel. Our agency is limited to perspective, watching Joel's years upon years of toughened cynicism and jadedness be eroded away. Joel needs Ellie, and tearing creative control away from the player at the last second does one of two things: appeals to the parent or angers the philosopher. It's a brilliant decision, and one that I admire and respect wholeheartedly. Having said that, if there is one thing that I don't like about this section, it's the fact that you can't spare all of the doctors. Joel will kill the lead surgeon regardless of whether you shoot or melee him. Even a bullet to the kneecap will kill him, and if you walk up to him and attempt to melee, Joel will brutally stab him with his own scalpel. This is presumably done to enunciate the fact that Joel is blinded by his compassion and fatherly devotion to Ellie, that he's willing to do all that must be done to save her life, but it is very unnecessary. Something about his blithe disregard for the surgeon's life is uncomfortable, though I'll concede that this was probably the point. As I said above, we are not playing our story, this is Joel's story whether we like it or not, and though we have a degree of agency, we cannot affect his motivations.
You just come after her.
Also, this is utter perfection.
Get away from her! Get away!
You can't save her, even if you get her out of here. What then? What then? She'll be raped and murdered. Raped and murdered.
It's not for you to decide!
It's what she'd want. It's what she'd want.
Surprisingly, you might say, I don't have a problem with the abrupt manner in which The Last of Us ends. Rather, I applaud it. Having a protracted ending would have ruined the atmosphere of these final few minutes, and they really are just minutes. You can speed through the final area in a matter of seconds if you so desire, though it would be an awful waste. The decision to, first, set this final scene in such a beautiful enclosed location, and second, to have the player control Ellie once again, evokes a comforting, yet paradoxically uneasy sensation. It is clear from her speech and body language that Ellie no longer trusts Joel, that she is angry at him for taking away what she perceived to be her only purpose. It is also painfully evident that she does not believe his half-truths about the Fireflies at all. Indeed, her interrupting of Joel's attempt at an inspiring monologue is exactly what the game needs to close out its story. We can see both of them struggling with not just their own survival, but the weight of Joel's lies straining their relationship. And for the briefest of instants, it seems that Ellie might abandon him. Joel is nervous and scared. He is truly terrified that Ellie will turn on him, and she knows that. She's not happy about what he did, but she accepts it. She knows how much he cares, and she in turn cares too deeply about him to question him further. She accepts it because she has no other choice. For better or worse, they are stuck together.
No matter what, you keep finding something to fight for. Now, I know that's not what you want to hear right now.
Swear to me. Swear to me that everything that you've said about the Fireflies is true.
I swear.
Okay.
This is not a happy ending. The game makes that abundantly clear, but then, did anybody expect as much? I won't say that the game's story is remarkable, cutting edge or innovative. It's predictable, clear-cut, but it never pretends to be anything else. This isn't a game about narrative twists and turns, nor is it too fussed about shocking you purely for shock value. What it does is craft a compelling character study, and politely asks if you'd like to enjoy the ride. And it is an enjoyable game, make no mistake. Despite my initial misgivings, repeat playthroughs have warmed me to the characters and their situation, elevating it above a general feeling of indifference to a state of appreciative acceptance. The Last of Us is not a perfect game. It possesses fantastic characters and a wonderfully written narrative, but its technical issues, standard gameplay and predictable storyline slightly limit it. To woefully resort to a subpar method of recommendation, I'd say that this game is an 8 or an 8.5 out of 10, 9 if you play the less buggy PS4 remaster. What it is instead is a perfect experience, a once-in-a-generation diamond, a touch rough around the edges, that presents us with unforgettable characters, gorgeous locales, and a world believably on the brink of extinction. It tugs at heartstrings and knowingly manipulates the player into pouring their heart and soul into its cast and concept. Crafting a pandemic around a real parasite, albeit one harmless to humans, grounds the game in a believable and strangely plausible reality. The characters, emotions, and struggles are natural and fully realised, and whilst it can be difficult at times to sympathise with them, as the decisions they are forced to make border more and more upon the unpleasant, The game's masterful storytelling prevents it from being too difficult or too disturbing to continue. Whilst I disagree that The Last of Us is a completely perfect game, there is no doubt that it is one of the best games of the previous console generation, and it is a true shame that it is limited to the Sony platforms.
What would you give?